You may have seen the epic 1962 film Lawrence of Arabia. Produced by David Lean, the film won 7 Academy Awards, introduced us to Omar Sharif, and saw Peter O'Toole in the lead role of T.E. Lawrence, the legendary British officer who led the Arab Revolt against the Turks in the First World War. But exactly who was the man behind the legend? What did he do? And why did he become a legend? This is the story of T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, a story of a complex, maverick archaeologist turned guerrilla leader who was part of a much bigger story. A story that continues to shape the Middle East to this day. Thomas Edward, or T.E. Lawrence, was born in North Wales in 1888. His birth certificate lists his parents as Thomas and Sarah Lawrence, which was not actually correct. His father was not Thomas Lawrence, but Sir Thomas Chapman, a married minor Irish nobleman with 4 children. His mother, Sarah, was the children's governess. Chapman abandoned his family to live with Sarah. Now, his wife, maybe unsurprisingly, refused his request for a divorce, and so Chapman and Sarah adopted the surname Lawrence and moved frequently to avoid scandal. The subject of our story, Thomas Edward, was the second of their 5 illegitimate sons. The shame he felt about his parents' relationship, his own illegitimacy, and beatings from his mother would leave deep psychological scars on the man who would become Lawrence of Arabia. The family eventually settled in Oxford in 1896. Fascinated by medieval archaeology, as a teenager, Lawrence cycled around the local countryside studying churches, before embarking on a journey all the way to the south of France, once more on his bicycle, visiting numerous castles en route. In 1907, Lawrence entered Jesus College, Oxford, to read history. As part of his thesis on Crusader military architecture, he undertook a 3-month, 1,000-mile walking tour of Syria, visiting dozens of Crusader castles. Travelling alone, he mixed with locals, learned to speak Arabic, and was beaten and robbed by brigands. Now, for most folk, that last experience might put you off the Middle East, but not Lawrence. After graduating with a first-class honours degree in 1910, Lawrence joined an archaeological excavation in Syria, working under Leonard Woolley of the British Museum. For the next 3.5 years, he worked on the project, becoming fluent in Arabic and developing a deep understanding and appreciation of Arab culture. In January 1914, Lawrence and Woolley were joined by Captain Stuart Newcombe of the Royal Engineers. The 3 men now embarked on a survey of the Sinai Peninsula, officially sponsored by the Palestine Exploration Fund, trying to locate the route of the Israelites' Exodus journey out of Egypt. But this was an elaborate camouflage. They were really conducting strategic reconnaissance on behalf of the War Office in London. The 3 men spent 6 weeks surveying water sources, terrain features, and potential invasion routes across the Sinai Peninsula in case the British were faced with an Ottoman invasion heading for the vital Suez Canal. Having been involved in that work, it came as no surprise that when the First World War broke out in August 1914, David Hogarth, his former mentor at university and now head of the Arab Bureau's intelligence operations in Cairo, sent for Lawrence. Arriving in Egypt in December 1914, T.E. Lawrence was given the rank of temporary second lieutenant and given a desk. By now, Ottoman Turkey had joined the war on the German side, and the Bureau's remit was to gather intelligence and disseminate propaganda in the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire. For nearly 2 years, Lawrence produced maps and intelligence reports on Ottoman forces, hardly the romantic figure of the legend. But events in the Hejaz, in the western region of the Arabian Peninsula, were about to change his life. Sharif Hussein bin Ali, Emir of Mecca, had been negotiating with the British about rising against the Ottoman Turkish rule. Between July 1915 and March 1916, Hussein exchanged 10 letters with Sir Henry McMahon, British High Commissioner in Egypt. Hussein wanted British recognition of a large independent Arab state encompassing modern-day Saudi Arabia as well as the area to the north, modern-day Iraq, Jordan, Syria, Israel, the Palestinian territories and Lebanon. McMahon's replies were deliberately vague about the politics, but very encouraging regarding the revolt, and for good reason. The British campaign against the Ottoman Turks was going badly wrong. By mid-1916, the Gallipoli campaign had failed catastrophically, and British forces at Kut al-Amara in Mesopotamia had surrendered after a 147-day siege. Meanwhile, Ottoman forces were now advancing across the Sinai towards the Suez Canal, Britain's vital lifeline to India and her empire beyond, such as Australia. Hussein's proposed Arab revolt could relieve some of that pressure. On the 10th of June 1916, with British encouragement, Hussein proclaimed a pan-Arab revolt. His forces took Mecca and Jeddah quickly, but Ottoman troops at Medina mounted a stubborn defence. The Turks now threatened to advance back down the Red Sea coast and recapture Mecca. Suddenly, Hussein's dream of independence and the British dream of a second front were in peril. Hussein desperately appealed to the British for support. With little manpower to spare, Lawrence was sent by the Bureau to assess how best the British could support the revolt. With Hussein now in his 60s, Lawrence was tasked with interviewing Hussein's sons to assess which could best lead an expanded revolt that could both keep the war going and tie down even more Ottoman troops. Lawrence concluded that Faisal, Hussein's third son, was the most capable commander. The Bureau now decided to send Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Newcombe, Lawrence's colleague from the Sinai Survey, to lead a permanent British liaison to Faisal's army. However, having struck up a personal relationship with him, Faisal requested that Lawrence also remain in his camp. Faisal and Lawrence now began to formulate their plan to take the war to the Turks. Rather than focus on capturing Medina or facing the well-armed Ottomans in a pitched battle, Faisal's army would conduct a guerrilla campaign, targeting the Hejaz Railway, the vital Ottoman supply line running from Damascus to Medina. It was a style of warfare suited to the fighting traditions of the Bedouin tribes in Arabia. It also suited the independently minded Lawrence. They would set the desert ablaze, and the legend of Lawrence of Arabia was about to be born. The popular image, reinforced by David Lean's 1962 film, is of Lawrence as a lone British officer leading Arab tribesmen across the desert, blowing up trains and capturing towns through sheer force of personality. The truth was that the Arab Revolt was never a one-man show led by a British officer. In reality, Faisal commanded the Arab Northern Army, with senior tribal leaders leading their men alongside that army in various operations. Whilst definitely participating in military actions, what Lawrence really brought to the party was an ability to help Faisal develop strategy, personally liaising with various Bedouin tribes to bring them on side, and acting as a pro-Arab liaison with the British to provide ever-increasing levels of support to the revolt. And whilst you might not have gleaned it from the 1962 film or popular stories about Lawrence of Arabia, he was also not the only British officer supporting the revolt. Lawrence himself listed 21 British officers who served in the revolt in his book 7 Pillars of Wisdom, and claimed that they all had stories as good as his. Men such as Colonel Cyril Wilson, who headed the British mission at Jeddah. Officially, his role was Pilgrimage Officer, a title designed to avoid Arab sensitivity about British soldiers near the Islamic holy cities of Mecca and Medina. Wilson's actual role was supervising the landing of military supplies and liaising directly with Sheriff Hussein. At the end of Wilson's life, General Reginald Wingate, commander or Sirdar of the Egyptian army, wrote to him stating that without his work, the revolt could never have succeeded. Wilson's influence over Hussein was at least as important as Lawrence's influence over Faisal. Then there was Lieutenant Colonel Stuart Newcombe. You might recall him as the British officer in Lawrence's secretive 1914 Sinai survey. By late 1916, Newcombe was appointed chief of the British military mission to the Hashemite forces. Ignored in popular history, many of the demolition raids on the Hejaz Railway were largely his work, alongside another officer, Major Henry Hornby. Lawrence himself wrote that the Arabs used to complain, "Newcombe is like fire, he burns friend and enemy." Newcombe was eventually captured by the Turks in November 1917, but escaped with the help of a French woman he'd met before the war in Constantinople. And they were married in 1919. What a great story to tell in the future. Irishman Colonel Pierce Joyce of the Connaught Rangers had been serving in Egypt since 1907. He commanded Operation Hedgehog, the ever-increasing British military mission to the Arab Northern Army. And by early 1918, Joyce had become Faisal's chief British liaison officer, while Lawrence spent more time raiding, intelligence gathering, and lobbying tribal chiefs to join the revolt. They were just some of the forgotten British soldiers, along with Indian and Gurkha troops, who were part of a much larger British effort to support the Arab Revolt. The British supplied over 30,000 rifles, accompanied by 15 million rounds of ammunition to the Arab armies. And as the Arab Revolt started to prove its value, they also provided Lewis machine guns, Stokes mortars, mountain guns, howitzers, Rolls-Royce armoured cars, and Talbot cars fitted with 10-pounder guns, all operated by British soldiers. Meanwhile, the Royal Flying Corps, later the RAF, flew missions to support operations, whilst the Royal Navy bombarded Turkish defensive positions and ferried supplies along the Hejaz coast as Faisal advanced northwards. By September 1918, the British government was spending £220,000 per month on the revolt, not just in men and arms, but also in gold, which Lawrence liberally used to bring various Bedouin leaders over to the cause. However, whilst just one British officer, Lawrence did in several ways stand apart. For a start, while several of his officer comrades were experienced with working with Arabs, mainly in Egypt and Sudan, Lawrence seemed to have a almost unique love and sympathy for them, or at least for the Bedouins. The most obvious example of that kindred spirit was his choice to wear Arab robes and headdress, something his fellow British officers refused to do. But where Lawrence really differed was that he genuinely believed in the Arab cause of an independent Arab kingdom headed by Hussein, covering all of the Arabian Peninsula, well, apart from the British bits, and the Levant region of the Ottoman Empire, with its capital at Damascus. This stance as a British army officer, but embracing the Arab cause, was a contradiction that would eventually tear him apart, as we will discover later. It's also easy from the film and the Lawrence legend to believe that the Arab Revolt was the Middle East campaign in World War I. The truth was both numerically and in casualties, it was a sideshow. The key theatres were in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, and the Sinai, Gaza Strip and modern-day Israel. In Mesopotamia alone, the British and Imperial forces suffered 92,000 casualties fighting the Ottomans, and a further 170,000 from illness. Allenby's expeditionary force in Sinai and Palestine suffered over 60,000 casualties. Those numbers might surprise those of you who've been swept up in the legend of Lawrence of Arabia. Nevertheless, the Arab Revolt was strategically crucial. It tied down Ottoman troops defending the Hejaz Railway, which was needed to supply their beleaguered garrison still holding out in Medina. Indeed, in a little-known chapter of the First World War, that Ottoman garrison, under Fakhri Pasha, would hold out in one of the war's most stubborn defences, refusing to surrender until the 10th of July 1919, a full 72 days after the final armistice. But before you think that the film was some sort of sham, that other British officers were doing the fighting whilst Lawrence simply played the role of advisor to Faisal, it's worth noting that he really did participate in military actions too, not least launching raids on Turkish trains and sabotage attacks on the Hejaz Railway. Possibly his greatest military achievement was the capture of the port of Aqaba on the 6th of July 1917. Very much Lawrence's idea, it was also an audacious gamble. He advocated that the Arab army, instead of launching a hit-and-run raid, would advance through what the Turks considered inaccessible desert and launch a surprise attack from inland, whilst the Turks had all their defences facing the sea. Not only was it audacious, it was also completely unsanctioned by his military superiors. But then, Lawrence was a maverick, and chains of command didn't worry him too much. The attack was a stunning success, with the garrison, taken by surprise, surrendering with minimal casualties on the Arab side. Whilst Lawrence should certainly be given credit for thinking it up, and encouraging the leader of the Hawatap tribe to accompany him on the mission, it was that leader, Auda Abu Tayi, and his men, who delivered the successful attack. Lawrence, who became legendary among many Arabs, was always part of the revolt, not its only leader. Following the capture, Lawrence rode by camel 150 miles through the Sinai Desert to the Suez Canal to request the Royal Navy deliver food and supplies to the Arab army and its Turkish prisoners. An impressive physical achievement in its own right. Aqaba's capture opened a port to supply Faisal's army and put direct pressure on the Ottomans' desert flank, meaning Turkish forces couldn't concentrate fully against General Allenby's main army. And on the 31st of October 1917, Allenby achieved his major breakthrough at the Third Battle of Gaza, including the famous charge of the Australian light horse at Beersheba. It was shortly after this success that a murky incident happened in Lawrence's life. In November 1917, he was captured at Deraa while on a reconnaissance mission. He later claimed in his book 7 Pillars of Wisdom that he was tortured and sexually assaulted by Turkish officers before escaping. This account, and indeed whether he was even captured at all, has been disputed by some biographers. Nevertheless, for his roles in both the capture of Aqaba and the Arab victory over the Turks at the Battle of Tafilah in January 1918, Lawrence was awarded the Distinguished Service Order, the DSO, and promoted to the rank of Lieutenant Colonel. With the British Army capturing Jerusalem and pushing north towards the Sea of Galilee, Lawrence now accompanied Faisal and his army as it advanced on the greatest prize in the Middle East, the historic city and proposed capital of the Arab Kingdom, Damascus. In the film, Lawrence and the Arab army famously enter the city in triumph. But that's not quite what happened, and triumph soon turned to disappointment. Firstly, Lawrence and the Arab army did not capture the city. It had already surrendered to an Australian officer. Whilst Allenby ordered British troops to bypass Damascus so the Hashemite army could indeed be seen as liberators, the 10th Australian Light Horse Regiment used the city as a shortcut in an attempt to encircle the fleeing Turks. Just before 7 AM on the 1st of October 1918, they reached the city square, where the Ottoman-appointed governor presented a letter surrendering the city to Captain Alden, a 37-year-old officer from Ballarat, Victoria. Alden accepted the surrender and then departed to continue on his mission. Lawrence arrived about 2 hours later in an open-top Rolls-Royce, ready to install a Hashemite government, only to find the city already in chaos. Bedouin and Druze auxiliaries were flooding in, bent on looting. The prisons had been opened, and 4,000 former inmates were now roaming the city and killing as many of the 20,000 Turks who'd surrendered as they could find, including the wounded. Civilians joined in the looting, whilst others desperately tried to protect their families and property. In the end, Allenby was forced to send in Australian troops under General Cheval to restore order. This was not the triumphant liberation that Lawrence had intended, and his Arab allies' disappointment was about to get a lot worse, as you're going to find out in a moment. But first, as you now realise that Lawrence didn't personally lead the Arab Revolt, and that other British officers were also involved, and that their involvement was part of a much bigger British Empire campaign in the region, how did T.E. Lawrence become the legendary Lawrence of Arabia? Well, interestingly, during the war he was never known by that name. He was simply T.E. Lawrence. And whilst reports of his actions with the Arab army, not least the capture of Aqaba, were reported in the press, he was simply part of a much wider story. That all changed in 1919. In that year, American filmmaker Lowell Thomas produced a silent movie called With Allenby in Palestine. It met with great success in America, but rather than the pictures of Jerusalem and its inhabitants or Allenby's Australian and British troops on the march, it was the shots of a 5'5", blue-eyed, blonde-haired British officer dressed in white flowing robes and riding a camel that really excited his audiences. Forget Allenby and his khaki-clad troops. Here was something extraordinary, exotic, romantic. By the time Thomas brought the film to London, he had renamed it with Allenby in Palestine and Lawrence in Arabia. Swiftly renaming him Lawrence of Arabia, Thomas presented Lawrence as a lone romantic hero, a scholar warrior who had single-handedly united the Arab tribes and liberated Damascus. The public couldn't get enough of this hero. Over 4 million people saw the film in the next 5 years, and Lawrence of Arabia was born. It was a legend that would snowball over the next few years, not least with the publication of Lawrence's own war memoir, 7 Pillars of Wisdom, which Winston Churchill said was, beyond doubt, one of the best books to come out of the Great War. As literature, 7 Pillars of Wisdom is undoubtedly a masterpiece, a vivid, compelling narrative. As history, it's more problematic. Lawrence's accounts of events in the book vary between different tellings, and sometimes were at variance with recollections of other eyewitnesses. But that aside, it fueled his growing reputation. Ironically, just at the time that Lawrence was starting to fall out of love with the Middle East, or at least what was happening to it after the First World War. In 1919, the very year that Lowell Thomas was elevating him to a legendary status, Lawrence accompanied Faisal to the Paris Peace Conference, which resulted in the Treaty of Versailles, to cash in on McMahon's promise of an independent Arab kingdom. But their dreams would be shattered. When Sir Henry McMahon had corresponded with Sharif Hussein about a revolt in return for an independent Arab nation, he had deliberately been vague as to the borders. But Hussein and his sons, including Faisal, believed that whilst the fine details could be sorted out later, they had a deal. But in May 1916, 1 month before the Arab Revolt began, Britain and France signed the Sykes-Picot Agreement. This secret treaty carved the Ottoman Middle East into British and French spheres of influence. The French would control Syria and Lebanon, Britain would control Mesopotamia, Iraq and Palestine. The agreement directly contradicted the spirit, if not the letter, of McMahon's promises to Hussein. Now, exactly when Lawrence was made aware of this treaty is unclear, but certainly by the time he was entering Damascus, he knew that the Arabs were about to be sold out. Indeed, it was one of the reasons that he was keen to enter Damascus first with the Arab army. If they could hold the city, well, then the French could whistle. But by then, the situation had got even more messy. In November 1917, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, promising support for, quote, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, unquote. This was a third commitment, fundamentally incompatible with the already conflicting McMahon letters promising some sort of Arab kingdom to Hussein, and the colonial carve-up contained in the Sykes-Picot Agreement. These were a circle that couldn't be squared, and they would lead to 100 years of turmoil in the region that continues to this day. At the Paris Peace Conference, it was the Sykes-Picot Plan, not Hussein's Arab state, that was implemented. In July 1920, French forces marched into Syria, defeated Faisal's army and occupied Damascus, and Faisal fled into exile. The Middle East descended into turmoil, not just because of the Sykes-Picot and the Balfour Declaration, but also due to infighting amongst the Arabs themselves, not least between city-dwelling Arabs in Syria and the desert tribes from Arabia. That infighting was no better exemplified than a war that shortly erupted between Hussein and his rival from Central Arabia, Ibn Saud. It would end in Saud's victory, Hussein now fleeing into exile, and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia being established in 1926. Back in March 1921, Winston Churchill, newly appointed Secretary of State for the Colonies, convened the Cairo Conference to address the chaos that was already erupting in the Middle East. At the Cairo Conference, Churchill appointed Lawrence of Arabia as his special advisor. Lawrence argued vociferously for some sort of Arab state that delivered on McMahon's original promises to Hussein. The British, who were unwilling to give up the old Ottoman territories that had been mandated to them by the League of Nations, Iraq, Transjordan and Palestine, or certainly whilst the French didn't give up their mandates in Syria and Lebanon, came up with a compromise plan. Two of Hussein's sons would be installed as kings in two of their mandates, Faisal in Iraq and Abdullah in Jordan. Whilst Lawrence later called this the period of which I am proudest, and that Churchill had made straight all the tangle, and Britain had fulfilled our promises in letter and spirit, it was far from the truth. It was a pale shadow of what he had believed in and fought for. Always a complex private man who struggled with his whole Lawrence of Arabia status, he now felt a sense of betrayal and opted for a life of anonymity. In 1922, he joined the RAF under the name John Ross, but when his alias was exposed by the press, he joined the Royal Tank Corps under another alias, T.E. Shaw, a nod to his friend George Bernard Shaw. In 1925, using that same alias, he rejoined the RAF as an aircraft fitter. He maintained this low-key role, incidentally contributing to the development of high-speed air-sea rescue launches, until his enlistment ended in 1935. During this period, he developed an obsession for motorbikes. In fact, he owned 7 of them, and wrote, "When my mood gets too hot, and I find myself wandering beyond control, I pull out my motorcycle and hurl it top speed through these unfit roads for hour after hour. My nerves are jaded and gone near dead, so that nothing short of voluntary danger will prick them back to life." He was racing along on one of those motorbikes near his little cottage at Clouds Hill in Dorset, when on the 13th of May 1935 he swerved to avoid 2 boys on bicycles. Thrown from the bike, he was rushed to a local army camp hospital, where he lingered in a coma without regaining consciousness for 6 days. He died on the 19th of May 1935, aged 46, and was buried at the nearby village of Morton. One of the doctors treating him was a young neurosurgeon named Hugh Cairns. Profoundly affected by watching Lawrence die, he began studying motorcycle head trauma, and his research would lead directly to the law that made the wearing of motorcycle crash helmets compulsory in the UK in 1973. The legend, immortalised in the film Lawrence of Arabia, presents T.E. Lawrence as a lone hero who liberated the Arabs through force of personality and tactical genius. But that's far from the truth. In fact, the truth as ever in history, is, and I hope you agree, far more interesting with so many sub-stories. And I'm going to explore some of those stories in a new series about the World War I Middle Eastern campaign in 2026. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss it. And if you like this story, well, then you might also enjoy this one too. And do check out my channel, over 200 videos to watch. Thanks for joining me today. Keep well, and I look forward to sharing more forgotten stories from British history with you very soon.